So my name is Yan Wong. I'm still a new member of this community. So today is my greatest pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Susan Williams is a Water Foskett Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Constitutional Democracy here at IU. Her scholarship focused on the intersection of feminist theory and issues in constitutional design, including plural legal systems, women's political representation, and the processes of constitution making. I really love what she said about how we shall not conduct a legal analysis in vacuum. Quote, law is the mirror in which we can read our character as a society, both as it presently exists and as we would ideally like it to be. Quote, I think in current context, this is very important to remember. So in addition to her outstanding scholarly career, Professor Williams also has advised constitutional reformers in many different countries, and I believe today's presentation is based on one of the experiences. So with that, one of the things I want to remind all of us is, so today's presentation would end 5 or 10 minutes earlier. So if you have questions, please just keep that in mind. With that, I'll give it to you.
Thank you so much. So first I will apologize for the inevitable coughing that will accompany this talk. But I'm a lot better than I was yesterday. So let me just give you a little framework for the paper. The paper was presented at a conference on women's participation in constitution making held at the EUI. And the conference basically involved people presenting papers on a very wide range of different countries and describing women's experiences in their constitutional processes. And many of the participants in the conference were historians, some were anthropologists, so the majority of the papers tended to be very descriptive in orientation. Law, however, is a prescriptive discipline. What lawyers do is they identify problems in the world and then they propose solutions to those problems. And so the orientation of this paper was very different from most of the others at the conference. The problem that I'm identifying here is not just the problem of the lower levels of participation by women in constitution making. That's obviously the practical problem. But it's also a theoretical, it's a scholarly problem. And the scholarly problem is that there are two very different literatures out there that address these issues. One is a theoretical literature, a political theory literature that talks about models of democracy, that tries to work out what the particular model I'm thinking of, dialogic democracy, would mean. And it's an incredibly rich and interesting literature. But it, for the most part, has completely ignored the process of constitution making. On the other hand, there is a very pragmatic literature, mostly produced by practitioners, but also some scholars. By practitioners, I mean people like International IDEA, UNDP, groups like that, that's aimed at the nuts and bolts of constitution-making processes. It's designed to advise people out there in the world who are about to set one up. Who should you put on your committee? How should you hold your hearings? What sorts of documentation should you keep? It's at that level of detail. These two groups of people and these two literatures are not talking to each other. And part of what I am hoping to do with this paper and with future work that I hope will grow out of it is to begin that conversation. Because I think, in fact, there is a lot of value for practitioners in the field struggling with concrete problems in thinking about these things from the perspective of the theoretical model of dialogic democracy. And the sort of three primary things I think I'm adding here are, first, the focus on the feminist version of dialogic democracy, because there are many, many different kinds. Second, the systemic approach to dialogic systems. And third, the multiplication of models of representation and the implications of those three things for constitution making. So this is very much in the early stages. The organizers of the conference are hoping to produce a book, but they do not yet have a publisher. So I have lots of time to revise, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
So, Susan, I've got a set of comments, but let me just raise one, which may be specific to Liberia, but the implication is that it may not be, and I want to push you on that. And this is, you said the most important defect of the Constitution is the strong presidential powers. And in the literature out there, which I've had a chance to survey this year, there's absolutely no relationship whatsoever between presidential powers, parliamentary systems, strong, weak, in terms of rights, in terms of growth, in terms of economic, legal, political development. So I just worry that this could be true with respect to Liberia, that it doesn't work, but it may not be the presidential system that's the problem. It could be a whole host of other things associated with corruption and other things. And then I worried even that there's a slight contradiction with the use of presidential powers, because on the one hand it sounds like, well, the president does whatever she wants. And then she starts this constitutional review, and she submits all this stuff, and she gets kicked in the teeth by the legislature, who says, oh, no, you don't. We have the power to do this. You don't have the power to do this. But 5 or 10 pages earlier, you told me the president gets whatever she wants. And so I thought, well, she didn't on this one. And even the logic of why there's many reasons why presidential power could not be good. But you wouldn't think it'd be coming from people who aspire to the presidency, because that's such a small percentage of the total members of Congress. I mean,
Not in Liberia.
how many members are in Congress?
No.
But I mean, the probability, if there's 100 in Congress,
Right.
and you're all equal, it's 1 out of 100, then that's
Yeah.
not good odds.
Good.
But that's a minor point. It's the other thing about presidential powers. I just want you to be cautious that maybe it's a Liberia specific, and it could be not the system, but something else that makes it seem as if presidential powers are really a
Very
disaster.
good. Thank you. No, I think that's it's a really important point. First thing is, the focus of this paper is not actually on the substance of the Constitution. It's
Right.
not actually on what's in there, what would be better, what's wrong with what's there. I did mention those things, you're right. I sort of talk about them by the by, but the focus here is really on the process. So that's why I don't go into any detail about these issues in this paper. But we have done other work on the substantive issues in Liberia. We've advised the Law Reform Commission on the list of amendments that we think they should be prioritizing. And reductions in presidential power are at the top of that list, and I can explain to you why. And I do think some of this is specific to Liberia. I don't think all of it necessarily translates, but I wouldn't rely on general lack of correlation between presidential systems and other indices like welfare and development and growth as necessarily relevant here. And the reason is, precisely as you point out, there are way too many other variables, right? That is, presidentialism means different things in different places, and it's the conglomeration of this collection of things that causes the problem, not just presidentialism. So I'm not making that claim, and I have no problem with that literature. In Liberia, so Liberia is a very, very small place. It's only between 3 and 4 million people. The political class is perhaps 10% of that, okay? So a few 100,000 people for the whole political class, okay? The same faces are recycled through offices in Liberia year after year, okay? One year someone is on the Supreme Court, the next year that person will be the Minister of Justice, you know. It is true that only one of them can be president, but the person who is president controls an enormous patronage network. In Liberia, the president appoints everyone down to the local dog catcher. Everyone, okay? And part of the move here was to create some sort of independent local government with an elected executive and an elected legislative body, because at the moment nothing like that exists. So who is president is everything. It's the control over this enormous state patronage apparatus. And it totally deforms politics in Liberia. Now, I would think that's generalizable to the extent that another country has a similarly ridiculously overpowerful president, which some other countries do. This is actually not an unusual African model. So I think you'd need to look into those details, but then I expect you would find that it generates similar sorts of political deformities in other places. In terms of, is the president really so powerful? This is a wonderful example. Yeah, the president is that powerful, but that doesn't mean she wins every time, right? And what's really interesting is what causes the occasional losses, right? And in this case, what caused it was straightforwardly the political self-interest of the other actors. That they saw this, I just can't tell you how many times people said to us, she's pulling up the ladder after her. And they just resented this in a very personal way. This was not about policy. This was not about what was best for Liberia, right? This was just about how dare she take advantage of all this power herself and then try to stop us from doing so when we get the office. And knowing that that dynamic is at work and that it is powerful enough to even cause people to buck a president, admittedly a late second term president, right? That I think is a significant fact. So I hope that answers some of your concerns.
But I think your first point, because I think it still is a controversial literature and it depends on representation, it depends on voting system, it depends on so many other things.
Absolutely.
That it takes away from the main message, which I felt was, as you said, how do we instill a better process for soliciting voice from all kinds of people?
I see.
And this could be, if this is part of it, then yes, but if it's not, then it's sort of a sideshow to what I thought you said, oh, rural women are more disadvantaged than urban women, and so on and so forth. And how do we solicit their views and the views of women who are under chiefs? And I thought all that was really fascinating, which is not surprising, the heterogeneity across views. So, and this just wouldn't be women, it would be all kinds of people, that there's a great deal of heterogeneity. And what you're trying to do is saying, democracies work really swell if you've got an extremely homogeneous population where everyone's income's equal and everyone's this, that, and the other. But there's no such place on the planet that's ever had that. But some places are closer to it than others. And I think that's what your process is, that in a system where democracy is so messed up, how do we instill a form of voice? And I think that was a really good message. And then how do you get there from here is the hard part.
It is. And so, okay, I understand now what the sort of larger concern was behind the specific questions you were raising, which is if you have these fundamental structural problems, what good is process going to do? Right? Can you actually come up with a process that will address those problems?
Yeah, that's.
I think that's right. I don't mean this to be a total solution. I don't actually see this process as reaching that central issue about the structure of the executive. I don't think, no matter how many different women you got involved in this process, you would not get basic reform of the executive out of it. But the thing is, there are other issues that the women care about that are also important. They may not be as central as the executive, but they matter. And those things could come out of this precisely because these other people don't care as much about that. So it's, but you're right, it's not going to fix that.
And I think that's hugely important, and then I won't say anything I think this is a situation where certain women's rights you could get, and as you said, you got close. Particularly, it's abominable what happens in some, and those things people may not care that much about who are in politics, and they throw people this bone, and we did this, but it's hugely important to those people who are suffering. But if we jump 2 orders of magnitude above, let's say Liberia, and go to a lot of Latin America, some of these processes may have a better chance of working. Educational levels are higher, so on and so forth. So in terms of that applicability, I think that's important to recognize that you're picking maybe the worst case scenario for this to have much hope of working.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that, and I hope that's right. If it can work in Liberia, it can work almost anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Claudia and Sarah.
Susan, I really enjoy your paper.
Oh,
amazing topic, and you write very beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
And reading that, I found that there is a lot of room to discuss that literature that talks about descripted versus substantial representation. And I think that that needs to be there. Because what you are telling us is that all these mechanisms that have been in place are necessary but not a sufficient condition to promote women's participation. So this literature that we have in political science and also in public administration talks about, well, quota laws actually do not work. Yeah, they just put women in certain positions, but as long as the process doesn't give them voice, nothing's going to happen. And this is one of the lessons that you introduce in the first part of the paper that says what we need to understand is not the mechanisms that brought them there, but what are the mechanisms that allow them to be heard. And I think that this is the most applicable thing to every setting. As a minority, I am always asked to be in every single committee. But then I said, if you don't allow me to talk or to express my ideas, what is the point of having me here?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that literature about descriptive and the substantial representation needs to be there.
Thank you so much. That's a great suggestion. I will definitely add more about that. I'm very interested in this because I'm very interested in the quota too, right? And again, this is one of the substantive recommendations, right, as opposed to the procedural issue about, but you're right, there's a direct relationship between those two, because the quota will only work if it is implemented in a way that includes all of the kinds of procedural guarantees for voice that we're talking about in the constitution-making process. That's exactly so. It's a really interesting thing in Liberia. It's a funny cultural tension. On the one hand, traditional Liberian culture, I think, although there's vast variation, I think it is fair to generalize and say traditional Liberian culture is very subordinated to women. They are, in fact, expected to be quiet in public, to not take part in decision-making processes, all those sorts of things. At the same time, Liberian women are not quiet. Okay, Liberian women are very forceful people, generally speaking. So somehow this culture produces women who actually speak up all the time. Or at least try. Okay, and they may not be the majority, but it's a substantial group that actually is vocal and aggressive about promoting their rights. So this is an interesting question, right? What would happen if you had more of them in the legislature? I'm not actually sure. It might work better in Liberia than it does in some other places. This is an example where Liberia actually may have an easier time, because the people who are likely to be in the legislature are, in fact, the more vocal women. And it's going to be hard to shut them up, actually. They're really pretty effective. The problem is, though, that there's also sort of a culture of very self-conscious war between the sexes, right? That is, when the women speak up, the men overwhelmingly, they laugh, they dismiss them, they there's none of the sort of veneer that we have here, right, of respect for gender equality. So in the absence of that, what you have is very vocal women who are just sort of banging their heads against a wall. And figuring out how to build a door through that wall, I agree with you. That's the crucial question.
I found this really fascinating, very different from my own work, and so it was interesting to look into this particular process. And so my question, actually, part of my question dovetails nicely with Claudia's, because I really wanted to hear more about descriptive versus substantive representation. And I also, especially because you emphasize the structural problem that women have less than like 10 or 11% of, like, that the women are of the legislature, that it's really hard to gain allies in the legislature. I was wondering if it would be useful to look at some examples of other places where there have been quotas. I understand that quotas don't do everything, right, but that quotas have been put in place to see at a threshold relatively similar, right, to see what allowed that to go through, just as a way of sort of bringing in other examples of processes that work or don't work. And related, I'm trained as a political scientist, but I don't do much with the Constitution, so this might be very dated. I know that in my PhD training, we learned a lot about consociationalism, and you speak quite eloquently about how one of the things that's particularly challenging for women is that women don't live in concentrated districts, and it's very hard to create patterns of representation around groups of people that are not concentrated in particular districts. But I was wondering if there might be any purchase kind of to go down that path as well, to think about how constitutional processes and designs have accommodated particular, like, other groups of people who might also live in really dispersed geographic settings, and how that might help to pick apart kind of what might work and what might not.
Yeah, right. So Malatun, of course, has this great article about reserved seats used for women and minority groups, and so it's sort of starting that kind of conversation. I think the quota literature that I'm familiar with worries about this exactly in terms of the particular mechanism that you would use to guarantee a level of representation for women. So you can use reserve seats much the way they are used for minority groups in countries where the minority group is disparate rather than geographically concentrated. Right? If they're geographically concentrated, you just create constituencies, right? But if they're not, then you create reserve seats, and then you have some kind of a voter list, and you let people pick their representatives that way. You can do exactly the same thing for women, and that actually is the most common model in Africa, the reserve seat model. It has a lot of problems. For starters, those women who are elected to the reserve seats tend to be elected through some process other than the normal process for electing all the other legislators, and so they are seen as second-class legislators. For another thing, they do not have a geographic constituency, and therefore they do not have the same power base as the other legislators. And thirdly, exactly how they are chosen to fill those seats really varies dramatically in different countries. So in some countries they are elected by the whole population. In some countries they are elected by only women. In some countries they are elected by bodies composed of leadership of women's organizations. In some countries they are appointed by the executive, the president or the king. It really varies dramatically. So they tend to have a lot less legitimacy. Liberia has a first-past-the-post electoral system. And it's really hard to make a candidate quota work in a first-past-the-post electoral system because the parties nominate the candidates for districts they know they're going to lose. So reserve seats are the typical way to go in this sort of a system. We actually talked to the Liberian Senate, the leadership of the Liberian Senate, about trying something really new. And they were going to do it. Oh, I was so frustrated when the legislature didn't take this up. It would have been the first time in the world that I'm aware of. We were suggesting that what they should do is a rotating seat system like the one in the Indian panchayats, but at the level of the national legislature. And we were, for the House, they have a bicameral legislature, so for the lower House, that's what we were suggesting. For the upper House, they have a Senate that has 2 senators from each county. Okay, they call them counties, but it's based on the American model. For that, we were suggesting a twinning arrangement. Reserve one of those Senate seats for a woman and one for a man in every county. Scotland did that in its first election after devolution of power, but only in its first election. So no place has created a twinning system permanently. No place has created a rotating system at the national level. It would have been really interesting to see what happened there. And I'm still hoping, right, that this will come back around. Just to give you an update, the presidential election will be in October. And to give you a sense of what presidential politics looks like in Liberia, there were about 20 people running, okay? So yes, there are, 100 people in the Senate, but like a fifth of them run. It does narrow down, though, and they have a majority system, which means however many make it to the actual election, it'll probably be 6 or 8 or 10. The top 2 vote getters, if nobody gets a majority, they'll have a runoff. One of the contestants, one of the candidates, is one of our PhD students. So we are keeping our fingers crossed, and if he is elected, there will be constitutional reform in Liberia, and I will come back and tell you what's going on in another year. But that's where we are right now.
Okay, Alex?
Yeah, so a process question, to go back to that deeper question, particularly around, if I read this right, the notion that in a dialogic deliberative system, you want to have women's groups because that will allow women's voices to then filter up into the constitutional making system. And I'm very sympathetic to that view, but you very quickly, especially given what else you say in the paper, run up against the problem, which is, well, what is representative of women as a group, since they appear, in your account, to be divided by rural, urban, Christian, Muslim, and I think in this context, most significantly, modern and traditional.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you know, I mean, this is a constitution-making process. South Africa is the case I know, but you have this deep-rooted problem of what do you do about the traditional authorities and what role do they have in making the Constitution, and what sort of protected terrain do they get, as they did in South Africa.
Yes.
And almost always this is, contradicts directly sort of universalist principles of gender equity.
Yes.
Again, you mentioned that. So how does that, both the process of coming up or defending the idea that there's a universal set of dialogic possibilities for women as women that overcome these other divisions, but also how you're going to negotiate this deep problem of traditional authorities, which also want to see at the table in constitutional protection for their views.
Excellent. Yeah. So my areas of expertise in terms of the substance of constitution drafting are rights and gender equality. And the gender equality part includes both quotas, right, political representation, and plural legal systems, the role of customary law. So this is an issue I care about a lot and have spent a lot of time talking to people about in Liberia and thinking about. Just to give you a little background, under the current constitution of Liberia, customary authority is recognized in a variety of indirect ways, but it is not protected as it is under the South African constitution. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's partly an artifact of the drafting of this, which was in the 1980s, so before this had quite the level of attention, and the very profound influence of American law, right? So chiefs, and the other thing you need to know is that the Civil War in Liberia had a tremendous impact on the customary system. The customary leadership was, well, I should actually say, even before the Civil War, the customary system had been hybridized, and many people would say co-opted by the state, long before the Civil War came into place. This happened because chiefs actually were appointed by the president. They had an official position. They operated sort of like magistrates, but to do that, they had to be appointed by the president. So chiefs curried favor with the central administration.
So it almost mimicked colonial indirect rule.
Exactly, exactly. And so people on the ground lost a lot of their faith in the customary system, even before the Civil War. Then the Civil War comes along, and the traditional structures were just destroyed. And it is, I say this in the paper, but I can't actually emphasize it enough. I've been to Liberia. I was there right after the election, the first election in which Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected. So at that point, the provisional government was still in control. The UN was still behind sandbags on the street corners. You can't, I can't even convey to you the level of destruction of everything, physical, social, cultural, everything. So the traditional authorities lost even more of their influence at that point. Nonetheless, there is no functioning legal system outside of Monrovia. Right? There are, I mean, realistically, there just aren't state-based courts for people to go to. So they go to customary dispute resolution mechanisms. This is the only option they've got, whether they really respect them or not, right? And so those people have some power. There is a tribal council. The tribal council is part of the conversation on constitutional reform. They want, one of the changes they want is recognition for customary law. There's a lot of attention to the fact that customary law differs from state-based law, and the legislature has at various points tried to codify, typical African phenomenon, tried to codify customary law in ways that are very destructive, right? So this is something people are talking about. I really think this is one of those issues where we need to have a much more sensitive view of who women are, right? The women activists in Monrovia really hate customary law. And they, when I held the meeting for them, that's who attended the meeting in Monrovia, they basically said, we want to get rid of it, right? That's just not practical, right? There is no alternative. It might be a good ultimate goal. I'm not going to argue with them about that, but it is not practical in the short term. Plus, there are a lot of women in the counties who would say, no, I don't want to get rid of it, right? Yeah, all right. This is my way of life. But I think the problem is, I think a number of them would also say, but, it's out of touch with current reality in a certain way. And it used to protect women better. And now, because things have changed, the rules don't work to protect us anymore, and we need to shift the rules to accommodate that. So those are the voices that I'm most concerned to have heard in this conversation. And figuring out how to do that is just a tremendous practical puzzle, right? Because you have to go to the places where they are. You have to arrange the conversation in a way that really allows them to speak and be heard. And that's
even amongst other women, right? Because of course the urban educated women are going to dominate in those conversations.
Well,
and rural women are
if you go out to the counties, the urban educated women won't be there. So the geography will help with that.
Yeah.
But you do have to get rid of the men. You have to get the men out of the room because they're not going to speak without that. And you also need to facilitate the conversation in a way that feels comfortable to them, right? Because if essentially the conversation is framed as, tell us what you want in the Constitution, it's like,
right.
You're not going to get an answer, right? So there has to be a very different approach here. And Lauren Morris McLean, who I was hoping might actually make it today, worked with me on designing exactly that. We created a questionnaire, we created a scoring mechanism for observers to use to try to collect data that would actually be verifiable in some remote sense, so that, because as I say in the paper, part of the problem here is these sorts of venues have no impact on the formal process, right? You could hold as many of these as you want. You could be as successful as you dream of in getting women to talk, but unless you can actually demonstrate what it is they've said in some fairly concrete way, no one is going to listen. So there has to also be this very empirical side to this of generating statistical data about what they want. And then bringing that to the ultimate decision makers and trying to use it to constrain what it is they do. So yeah, there are a lot of moving parts here. I think this is obviously just a first stab at a much bigger project.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder, in part of your answer to Alex, you mentioned the structure of the legal system in terms of application and enforcement. And so in light of the poor level in which these institutions are developed, and in that paired with the structural ossification of the institutions at the national level, I wonder if constitutional amendments, if a constitutional process is a bar that is set too high. And so because you are talking about processes at the local level, I wonder if you don't necessarily need to eliminate the bar, but it seems to me that perhaps you can get more purchase in terms of discussing potential positive spillovers from this process than framing success as purely a matter of, is this law or amendment actually written down in a text that no one will ever implement?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's exactly right. And the paper is about the amendment process, and so that's sort of how I framed it. But you're right. That's by no means the only valuable thing that could come out of this, or even necessarily the most valuable thing. It's interesting. The different kinds of things that need to be done, some of them can be done in other ways, and some of them can't. The quota, Liberia had a gender quota. It was in the first election after the peace process. It was a candidate quota in a first past the post system, and it was completely ineffective. So people in Liberia think quotas don't work. And so the first thing is just to say, hey, there are other ways to do it. You can make it effective. You just have to design it properly for your electoral system. But it's very difficult to get it through the legislature. And the Liberian Supreme Court. So Liberia is just such an interesting place. They really model themselves on the U.S. The Liberian Supreme Court has a very powerful sort of power of judicial review. They do strike down legislation. It's entirely possible that they would strike it down based on their understanding of their equal protection clause, as our Supreme Court would strike it down based on our understanding of our equal protection clause. So it is likely that it's not useful to use a huge amount of resources to get it passed as a statute. It probably makes more sense to go straight for the Constitution as a way of avoiding that problem. Right, that's what happened in Italy, right? It's what happened in France, right? So it's a very plausible outcome, and we want to try to avoid it. The customary law stuff, actually a lot of that could probably be done by statute. I don't think there's any reason why it has to be in the Constitution. The interesting thing about the customary law stuff, though, in Liberia is, as I said, what you've got is this very strange hybrid system. So you've got customary systems operating on the ground in a fairly informal way. They don't generate any records. They do generate decisions. Sometimes people are unhappy with those decisions, and they go to the state-based courts, and the state-based court knows that a customary court did something, but they have no rules about whether they're supposed to respect it or not. There is customary law that is applied by the state-based courts, the part that's been codified by the legislature. So they will say, we are applying this customary law in this statute, right? And then there are things that, for example, the Supreme Court has said are unconstitutional as part of the customary system. Liberia traditional system includes trial by ordeal. And so in a criminal case, the defendant can be subjected to a poison taken from the bark of the sassywood tree. And if the person recovers, then they're innocent, and if they die, then they were guilty. And the Supreme Court has said this is unconstitutional. Really interestingly, it is not unconstitutional because it is cruel and unusual, which they've got to, right? It is unconstitutional because it is self-incrimination, which is to say they believe it works, right? And because it works, you can't make someone
Is this an all
worse.
case or just witchcraft cases?
All criminal cases. This is not specific to witchcraft. So the point is you've got this really kind of complicated interaction between the two systems. What the tribal council wants, the authorities want, is greater recognition for customary law. They want state courts to be instructed to respect the judgments of customary courts. They want, they're kind of divided over whether they actually want the legislature to codify it or whether they want to be left to say what it is themselves, right? But in any event, they want it formalized, okay? This is, in my view, terrible. This is terrible for women, obviously, because the people saying what customary law is at the moment are not women. They don't include any women. So women's voices are no part of sort of determining what this system is. And because it freezes it at that moment in time and just kills the process of sort of development of custom in light of changes in the world. So the question is, how do you create more recognition for customary law, which just as a reality is a necessity, okay? So create more recognition for customary law, make sense of the way the two systems interact, without creating customary law as sort of the little brother, right, of the statutory law, without formalizing it in these ways and freezing it in these ways. And I think there are ways to do that, and I think some of that could be done through statutory means, or even just, by changes in the communities. And yeah, I agree with you. Holding a process like this could really help. It could give women the experience of participating in these sorts of large-scale policy decisions that might, and it could facilitate organization, it could facilitate the transfer of resources to people on the ground in the counties. It could do all sorts of things that then have other good effects. Yeah.
But if no one else has questions, because I don't want to take someone else's time.
Oh, okay, now I'll ask a question.
Okay.
It's actually following Federica's question. I think the process part is really crucial actually for your story, because when you were talking about how dialogical process is very important, and you talk about debate, I think it's really important to frame the question in a different way, because, I mean, as a matter of fact, yes, it is a failure of legislation, but it could have been a very fruitful process that can lead to a lot of, other positive outcomes. So that is a real missed opportunities. And I think that could be, highlighted up front and for people to really appreciate it. And another related question is, I think it is no doubt that if you have homogeneous population, it's probably easier. However, I mean, a heterogeneous population is also a blessing. It's really about how election, I really like how you talk about election, not simple election, but how to really, conduct it. How to, I mean, it would be really helpful if I'm just interested in knowing, like, what you think of how to make this process to generate, coalition or alliances rather than division.
That's a really good point.
Because you talk a lot of things about disabled population, like ethnic groups and so on. So it's just based on your experience there, like what kind of procedure or what kind of steps that can be taken to encourage people to speak to each other rather than just hate each other. And on that, I'm just curious about, it is an article about women's participation. Sometimes I get a little bit feel like gender gets a little bit lost a little bit, because I'm not so sure What's so distinctive about gender issues there? Other than like women, I love how you talk about women actually very vocal there. Yes. At least part of the women. So what is so special about gender issues in that environment compared to other issues that the legal process have to cope with?
Okay, wonderful. So I know there was a second question in the middle that I now have missed, so remind me about it when I finish answering the two that I got, okay? So the first one was about coalitions and how you help build the coalitions. Oh, I know, and the second one was how you build dialogue so that people are not just hating each other. So I just have to tell you this story. I mentioned the Constitutional Convention that the president called. This was a total zoo. It was unbelievable how badly this was handled. She got all these people together. She put them out in the county, away from Monrovia, and she gave them a list. The Constitution Review Committee produced a list of things they had heard that people wanted. And they started talking about this list. And there was very little control over either the agenda or the sort of method of conversation, right? And what happened was that the whole thing was hijacked by a particular group that wanted to add this amendment to make Liberia a Christian country. And as I mentioned, Liberia has a substantial Muslim minority. The delegates were inside the convention hall arguing about this. And the imam of the local area got together his followers, and they were outside the convention hall demonstrating against this proposal. And he was actually saying exactly the right thing. He was saying, how will making Liberia a Christian country improve the roads? How will making Liberia a Christian country get us health care or education? How is this responsive to any of the things we all care about? Meanwhile, the people inside the hall were singing hymns and dancing in the aisles and passing this resolution. I think this is just a sort of very powerful example of how the idea that you can just get a bunch of people together in a room and that that's going to generate a productive democratic conversation is nuts, right? That if we aren't paying attention to process, if we aren't paying attention to exactly how this is done, to facilitation, to agenda setting, to making sure that various groups get heard in the conversation, if we aren't paying attention to those sorts of things, what is going to come out of it is going to be bad rather than good. And God knows we may be witnessing that ourselves now, right? So I think this is the central question. I don't have the answers. All I know is people haven't been paying nearly enough attention to that. In terms of coalition building, the women in Liberia did a great job of coalition building across certain lines. There was a lot of joint work with groups for the disabled and with groups that were interested in the rights of children. So I think they're very good at that, actually. And would be worth thinking about the specific techniques involved there as well. And the last thing you said is what's special about women. Here I actually want to just say nothing is special about women in terms of their role in democracy, except that they are over half the population. That is, the same principles apply for all marginalized groups. I don't see this as specific to women. I think you could take the exact same dialogic models, the same focus on system, the same focus on representation, and think about ethnic minorities, religious minorities, all sorts of different groups, okay? So I think the tools work across those groups. What's special about women is they're actually a majority. They are a dispossessed majority, not a dispossessed minority. And they are therefore a fundamental challenge to democracy. Societies that consider themselves democracies and that have poor representation for women in their political decision-making should be ashamed of themselves. That counts, the US counts. We are 60-something in the world in terms of the level of political representation for women. We have 17, I think we're up to 18% female representation in our national Congress. And that's in a country where over 50% of college graduates are women, where over 50% of people in the workforce are women. This should be a shocking thing. And that's the only thing that I think is different. Maybe that's a good place to end. Thank you guys, this was really helpful.
Thank you. Let's give her another applause.